left for dead by her Apache tribe for being legless. She was saved only by a lonely farmer. The buzzards circled overhead as Jacob Murphy rode his wagon along the desert trail. He squinted against the afternoon sun, wondering if some animal had died nearby. The birds kept swooping lower, their shadows dancing across the red sand like dark omens against the earth. Something felt wrong about their pattern, wrong about the way they moved. They weren't feeding on carrion. They were waiting for something to die. Jacob pulled the reins and stopped his horse. The animal stamped nervously, tossing its head and snorting, sensing something in the air that human senses couldn't quite detect. Jacob grabbed his rifle from beside the seat, more out of long habit than immediate fear. Living alone on a farm 30 miles from the nearest town taught a man to be ready for anything at any moment. He climbed down from the wagon seat, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth that cracked like old pottery, and walked toward the rocky outcrop where the buzzards had gathered in their grim, patient vigil. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, like invisible hands pushing against his shoulders. Sweat trickled down Jacob's back beneath his worn cotton shirt, the fabric sticking to his skin. He'd been coming back from town with supplies, flour and coffee and nails, when he spotted the circling birds. Part of him wanted to keep riding, to mind his own business and get home before dark. Life was simpler that way, cleaner. But another part, the part that still remembered what it meant to be human, what it meant to have a soul, pushed him forward toward whatever waited among those sun-scorched rocks. That's when he saw her, and his heart nearly stopped in his chest. A young Apache woman lay motionless among the stones, her body curled on its side as if she'd simply fallen asleep. Her dark hair spread across the ground like spilled ink, tangled with dust and small bits of desert debris. She wore a simple dress made of deerskin, once fine work but now faded and stained from endless days of exposure to sun and wind. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he ran toward her, waving his arms wildly to scatter the birds. They lifted reluctantly into the sky with angry shrieks, their voices harsh and accusing, circling higher but not leaving entirely. They knew patience. They could wait a little longer. He knelt beside her in the dirt and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, pushing aside the dark curtain of her hair with his other hand. A pulse fluttered beneath his fingertips. Faint, irregular, but there. Relief flooded through him like cold water. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from days without water, her face sunburned beneath the natural bronze tone of her skin. When he touched her forehead, her skin burned with fever, hot enough that he jerked his hand back instinctively. Then Jacob's gaze traveled down her body, and he saw why she'd been left behind, and his breath caught painfully in his throat. Both her legs ended at the knees. Old scars, white and weathered, marked where they'd been taken, probably years ago based on how thoroughly the wounds had healed. Someone with knowledge and skill had wrapped her stumps in leather and cloth, carefully and with obvious care, but the bindings were loose now, coming partly undone after days of her lying here helpless and alone. Beside her, on the ground, lay an empty water skin, the leather cracked and bone dry, and a small cloth bundle that had once held dried meat. Now it contained only a few crumbs and the memory of food, long since consumed. Jacob didn't waste time on hesitation or doubt. He scooped her into his arms, lifting her as gently as he could manage, and carried her to the wagon. She weighed almost nothing. Like a child, despite being clearly a full-grown woman in her early 20s, her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel every bone in her body through the thin deerskin dress. He laid her gently in the back of the wagon, cushioning her head with a folded blanket he'd just bought in town for the coming winter. He grabbed his canteen, poured water onto a clean cloth, and pressed it to her lips, letting just a few drops trickle into her mouth. Too much water too fast after severe dehydration could kill her as surely as no water at all. The ride back to his farm took 2 hours of hard, rattling travel. Jacob pushed the horse harder than he normally would, harder than was probably wise, glancing back over his shoulder every few minutes to check if she still drew breath. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the wagon bed into something like an oven. He stopped twice along the dusty trail to give her more water, just small, careful amounts so she wouldn't choke, and to wet the cloth again to lay across her burning forehead. Each time he stopped, he wondered if this would be the moment he'd find her dead, but each time her chest still rose and fell in shallow breaths. When they finally reached his small farmhouse, set alone in a valley between red hills, Jacob carried her inside to his own bed without a second thought. He'd never had a woman in his home before, not once in the 5 years since he'd bought this land. Never had a woman in his bedroom, never had anyone but himself sleep in that simple wooden bed, but propriety and custom seemed foolish and small when someone's life hung by such a fragile thread. The bed was simple but clean, made that very morning before he'd left for town with military precision. He laid her down as gently as if she were made of spider silk and began the work of saving her life. He cleaned her face and arms with cool water from the pump outside, water he'd hauled up from deep in the earth. Her fever raged like a wildfire beneath her skin, hot enough that the wet cloth he used seemed to dry almost instantly. He knew infection could be spreading through her body from any number of causes, invisible enemies working in her blood. Jacob had medical knowledge from his years as a soldier in the war between the states. He'd seen strong men die from fevers, from infections that started from the smallest scratch, from exposure to the elements when they'd been left wounded on battlefields. He checked her stumps with careful, gentle hands, unwrapping the bindings that someone had applied with obvious skill. The wounds were old, years healed, the flesh smooth and sealed, not the source of her current crisis. Someone had amputated her legs with knowledge and precision, probably saving her life when they'd done it, cutting away dead or damaged tissue before it could poison her whole body. The fever burning through her now came from dehydration and exposure, from lying in the brutal desert sun for days with no water and no shelter, her body slowly shutting down one system at a time. Throughout the evening, as the sun set and darkness claimed the desert, he continued giving her water, a spoonful at a time, letting her body absorb it slowly, coaxing life back into her, one small sip at a time. He prepared a weak broth from vegetables and a bit of precious salt, managing with infinite patience to get a few spoonfuls down her throat past her cracked lips. Her body needed more than water alone to recover from this ordeal. It needed nourishment, minerals, something to rebuild what the desert had stolen. As full night fell and the desert cooled, he sat in his only chair beside the bed, watching her chest rise and fall with each labored breath. Questions filled his mind, circling like those buzzards had circled overhead. How long had she been out there under that merciless sun? Could it have been a week? Why had her people left her in such a place? The Apache were known to take care of their own, to value each member of the tribe. He'd always heard that about them. But he'd also heard other stories, darker stories, of times when survival meant impossible choices, when a tribe running from soldiers or fleeing from settlers couldn't afford to slow their pace for anyone who couldn't keep up on their own. Jacob thought about his own loneliness as he kept his vigil, the empty years that had stretched behind him since the war finally ended. He'd bought this land with his mustering out pay to escape the world, to forget what he'd seen and done in 4 years of blood and fire. The screams of dying men still echoed in his dreams. The smell of gunpowder and blood still filled his nose some mornings when he woke. The faces of young boys who'd died under his command, boys barely old enough to shave, haunted him in the quiet hours. He'd wanted silence and solitude. Nothing more, nothing less. Just a place to exist until his time ran out. Now fate or providence or blind chance had brought to his doorstep someone who needed him more desperately than anyone ever had. Her eyes opened just before midnight. One moment she was unconscious, the next those dark eyes were open and looking at him. They were bright with fever, too bright glittering in the lamplight, but they were aware and seeing. She looked at him without the fear he'd expected, without the terror most Apache showed when they found themselves at the mercy of a white man. That surprised him more than anything. Then her gaze swept slowly around the unfamiliar room, taking in the simple rough furniture, the rifle hanging on pegs on the wall, the window with its thin cotton curtains, trying to understand where she was and how she'd come to be here. Her lips moved, forming words, but no sound emerged from her damaged throat. Jacob quickly brought the cup of water to her mouth, supporting her head with one hand, his touch as gentle as he could make it. She drank greedily, desperately, and he had to pull the cup away before she took too much. She coughed, water dribbling down her chin, and he wiped it away with the cloth. Easy, he wanted to say, but the words stuck in his throat. She'd already closed her eyes again, the small effort of drinking exhausting what little strength she'd gathered. Her breathing evened out, deeper now, more natural. The crisis point had passed. She would live through this night. Whether she'd live through another was still uncertain, but she'd survived this one. Jacob leaned back in his chair, feeling exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. He would save her, he decided. Whatever it took, however long it required, he would pull her back from the edge of death where the desert had left her. He owed that much to the universe, maybe. For all the death he'd dealt in the war, maybe he owed one life saved. Or maybe he just couldn't bear to let another person die alone if he had any power to prevent it. He closed his eyes for just a moment, listening to her breathe, and made his promise to the darkness and to himself. Morning light crept through the window like a shy visitor as Jacob heated broth on his cast-iron stove. He'd been awake all night, monitoring the woman's breathing, giving her water every hour by the watch he'd carried through the war. His eyes burned with exhaustion. gritty and sore, but he couldn't let himself rest until he knew she'd truly survived the worst of her ordeal. Her fever had broken near dawn, the crisis passing like a violent storm that finally moves on to torment other places. Now she slept more peacefully, her face relaxed instead of twisted with pain, her breathing deeper and more regular, the breathing of genuine sleep rather than unconsciousness. When he returned to the bedroom with a bowl of warm broth and a clean spoon, her eyes were open and watching the doorway. She tracked him as he approached, her gaze alert but still weak, still recovering. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, a sharp awareness that took in everything about him, cataloging details with the care of someone who'd learned that observation meant survival. And there was strength, too, a core of steel that told Jacob this woman had endured more than most people could imagine, and had come through it unbroken. Jacob sat carefully on the edge of the bed, not wanting to jostle her, and helped her sit up against the pillows he arranged behind her back. She winced as her body protested the movement, muscles stiff from days of lying motionless on hard ground, but she made no sound of complaint. Her jaw was set, her teeth gritted. Pain was an old companion to her, Jacob realized. She knew how to bear it without crying out. He lifted a spoonful of warm broth to her lips. She hesitated, her eyes moving from the spoon to his face and back again, as if trying to determine his intentions and whether she could trust this stranger who'd taken her from the desert. Then she accepted the spoon, letting the broth slide into her mouth. They continued this way in complete silence for several minutes until the bowl was empty, him offering each spoonful with patient care, her accepting each one with cautious trust. When he set the bowl aside and poured fresh water into a cup, she took it with trembling hands that could barely grip the simple vessel. She drank deeply, greedily, some of the water spilling down her chin to dampen the collar of the simple nightshirt he dressed her in. She didn't seem to notice or care about the spillage. "I'm Jacob," he said when she'd finished drinking, touching his chest with one hand. Jacob Murphy. She studied him for a long moment with those keen eyes, taking in his weathered face with its war scars, his calloused hands that showed years of hard labor, the worry lines around his eyes that spoke of things seen and done that no man should have to see or do. "Kaya," she replied finally, her voice rough and damaged from dehydration and from days of screaming for help that never came. Over the following days, as Kaya's strength slowly returned like water filling a dry well, Jacob learned her story in bits and pieces. She shared it reluctantly at first, uncertain whether this white man could understand or would judge her for circumstances beyond her control. But Jacob listened without judgment, without the horror or pity she'd learned to expect, and gradually the full tale emerged. Kaya spoke English well, almost as well as she spoke her native tongue. She'd learned it from missionaries who'd visited her people years ago when she was still a child with 2 working legs. Her mother, a woman of great foresight, had encouraged her to learn everything the missionaries would teach. Knowledge of the white man's tongue might save her life someday, her mother had said. How terribly, perfectly right she'd been. Those words had been prophecy. She'd lost her legs to frostbite during a terrible winter when she was 12 years old. It had been a hunting accident, she explained, her voice distant as she traveled back to that frozen day. She'd been tracking a deer through fresh snow, moving silently the way her father had taught her since she was old enough to walk. She'd been a good hunter even then, small and quick and quiet. The deer had led her far from the main camp, farther than she'd realized. Then a rock slide, loosened by melting snow, had trapped her against the base of a cliff face. Heavy stones had pinned her legs, crushing them, and she'd been unable to move enough to free herself. By the time her family found her 3 days later, her feet and lower legs were black and dead, the flesh frozen solid as winter ground. She'd survived those 3 days by crawling to a small cave in the cliff face, just large enough for her body, where she'd been partly sheltered from the killing wind. She'd kept herself awake by singing every song her grandmother had ever taught her, singing until her voice gave out, knowing that to sleep in that cold meant to never wake again. She'd sung songs of creation and songs of war, songs of love and songs of mourning, songs she barely understood but remembered perfectly. The tribe's medicine woman, an old grandmother everyone called Standing Bear, had cut away the ruined flesh to save her life. Kaya remembered the agony with crystal clarity even all these years later. They'd given her herbs to dull the pain, medicine that made the world swim and blur, but nothing could truly stop that kind of hurt. Standing Bear had heated her knife in the fire until it glowed, had cut clean through flesh and bone, then had cauterized the wounds with burning brands. Kaya had passed out from the pain partway through, which had probably saved her sanity. When she'd finally woken days later, weak and feverish, her legs were gone, but she was alive. That was the trade the spirits had offered, Standing Bear had told her. Your legs for your life. She'd accepted the trade, though she'd had no choice in the matter. For years afterward, her mother and sister had cared for her with patient devotion. They'd fashioned devices to help her move, wrapping her stumps in protective leather sewn with skill and care, making smooth boards she could use to scoot along the ground. Kaya had learned to do almost everything from that position, refusing to become useless. She could cook over a fire, tan hides with the same quality as anyone else, sew clothing with tiny perfect stitches, and even help with gathering tasks when the plants grew low to the ground. The children of the tribe had loved her especially, because she always had time for their games and stories, unable to rush away to other work like the busy adults always did. She'd become the keeper of stories, the one who remembered all the old tales. But both her mother and sister had died last spring from spotted fever, the terrible sickness that had swept through several tribes like an invisible enemy. Within 2 weeks, they were both gone, buried in the traditional way, leaving Kaya alone in the world. After that, the tribe had faced harder and harder choices. Game had become scarce as white settlers pushed farther and farther into their traditional hunting grounds, claiming land that had belonged to the Apache since the beginning of time. Taken, the great buffalo herds that had sustained the plains tribes for generations were dwindling, slaughtered by white hunters who took only the hides and left the meat to rot. Soldiers hunted the Apache relentlessly, attacking camps without warning, killing women and children. The tribe needed to move fast and move often, covering rough terrain that would be nearly impossible for Kaya to navigate without legs. The chief, a man named Running Elk, who'd known Kaya since the day she was born, had wept when he made the decision. Kaya had seen the tears running down his weathered face. He'd given her all the supplies he could spare, water and food and good leather bindings, and had left her in a place near the road where she might be found by travelers heading to the white man's town. It wasn't cruelty, she explained to Jacob, with no bitterness or anger in her voice. It was survival, pure and hard. The alternative was watching everyone starve while they slowed their pace for one person who couldn't keep up. Or worse, having soldiers catch them because they moved too slowly. Running Elk had given her a chance, which was more than many chiefs would have done. He'd left her where white people traveled, gambling that someone with mercy might find her. Jacob listened without judgment, his face neutral but his eyes kind. He'd seen enough of life and war to know that desperation made people do things they'd never imagine in better times, in easier days. War had taught him that survival sometimes required terrible choices that haunted you forever after. What mattered now? The only thing that mattered was that Kaya was here, alive, and growing stronger each day that passed. Within a week, she could sit up on her own and feed herself without assistance. Her hands had regained their strength and steadiness. Jacob fashioned a wheelchair from an old wooden chair he'd been meaning to repair, and 2 wagon wheels he had stored in the barn. It wasn't pretty to look at, and it wobbled a bit when it rolled, but it worked well enough. Kaya's face lit up like sunrise the first time she successfully rolled herself to the window and looked out at the farm that had become her refuge. "You have good land," she said, taking in the orderly fields and the sturdy barn, the chicken coop with its dozen hens, and the vegetable garden that showed signs of neglect but good soil. "It's decent enough," Jacob replied, standing beside her and looking out at his small domain. "Grows what I need to survive." "You live alone here?" Jacob nodded, staring out at the land he'd bought with blood money from the war. 5 years now. Since the war ended and sent us all home. That's a long time to be alone with only your thoughts. He didn't answer that observation. Some truths were better left unspoken, some wounds better left unexamined. The war had taken everything from him, everyone he'd loved. His wife had died while he was away fighting in some godforsaken corner of Virginia, taken by cholera before anyone could even get word to him that she was sick. He'd come home after 4 years of fighting to find an empty house and an empty future. The farm was supposed to give him purpose, a reason to wake up each morning, but mostly it just gave him something to do with his hands while he waited to die. Kaya proved herself remarkably useful despite her obvious disability. Within 2 weeks of regaining her strength, she was doing most of the household work that Jacob had been neglecting for years. She could prepare food that actually tasted good, mend clothes so the repairs barely showed, and tend the vegetable garden from her wheeled chair. Her hands moved with practiced skill born from years of adapting to her limitations, whether she was kneading bread dough or stitching up a torn shirt. The bread she made was better than anything Jacob had managed in 5 years of trying, light and flavorful instead of dense and tasteless. The vegetables she planted grew in neat rows, properly spaced and carefully weeded, instead of the haphazard chaos of Jacob's previous attempts. Jacob had never asked for her help, had never expected any kind of payment for saving her life, but he found himself profoundly grateful for her presence. The house felt different with her in it, different in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Alive somehow, lived in. There were good smells of cooking instead of the smell of loneliness. There were sounds of purposeful movement instead of silence broken only by his own heavy footsteps. There were signs that someone other than him existed in this small corner of the world. 3 weeks after he'd found her dying in the desert, trouble arrived with the thunder of many hooves and the shouts of angry men seeking blood. Jacob was in the barn repairing a broken wheel, his hands covered in grease, when he heard horses approaching fast from the direction of town. Multiple riders, at least 5 or 6, moving with aggressive purpose. The sound made his stomach tighten with old soldier's instinct. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the barn wall and stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, shading his eyes against the glare. 5 men on horseback were circling his property in a clear pattern of intimidation, their faces hard and suspicious and angry beneath wide-brimmed hats. They were armed with rifles and pistols, dressed like ranchers but moving like a lynch mob. The leader, a thick-necked man named Bill Carson, whom Jacob recognized from occasional trips to town, pointed at the farmhouse with his rifle like he was pointing at an enemy position. "We tracked an Apache here, Murphy," Carson shouted, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. "We know you got one of them inside your house." Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle until his knuckles went white. He kept his voice steady, despite his heart racing like a war drum. "I've got a woman who was dying in the desert when I found her. I gave her shelter and medical care. That's all." "That's harboring the enemy," Carson spat, his face red with rage and something uglier. "That's treason against your own kind. Those savages killed my brother last month, murdered him in cold blood, burned his ranch to the ground, and took his scalp while he was still screaming. We're cleaning them out of this territory, every last one of them, and anyone who protects them goes too. She's not your enemy," Jacob said firmly. "She's not anybody's enemy. She can't even walk, for God's sake. She has no legs. She's no threat to anyone." Another rider, younger and meaner looking with a livid scar across his left cheek, urged his horse forward aggressively. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip. "Get out of the way, Murphy, or we'll go through you to get to her. Makes no difference to us whether you live or die. Your choice." Jacob raised his rifle to his shoulder in one smooth motion, the movement automatic and precise from years of military training and muscle memory. "First man who tries to enter my house gets a bullet through his chest. Second man gets one too. I promise you that, and I don't miss. Ever." The standoff lasted an eternity, though it was probably only a handful of seconds. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands stayed rock steady on the rifle. He'd faced worse odds during the war, had stood his ground against charging cavalry with sabers raised and against artillery that screamed overhead. These were farmers and ranchers playing at being soldiers, not real fighters who'd seen genuine combat. But they were angry, and angry men did stupid, unpredictable things. Angry men got people killed. Carson finally backed his horse up a few cautious steps, though his face remained twisted with hate and frustration. "You're making a mistake, Murphy. A fatal mistake. The Apache are animals, not people. They don't deserve mercy. They don't deserve to live. They deserve to be wiped from this earth." "She deserves to live," Jacob said quietly. "That's all the reason I need." "You'll regret this decision," Carson promised darkly. "We'll be back, and next time we won't bother asking nice. Next time we'll burn you out and string you both up." The men finally rode off in a cloud of dust and muttered threats, but not before the young one with the scar turned in his saddle and deliberately fired a shot that splintered the wooden doorframe of Jacob's house, sending splinters flying, a warning of what was to come. Jacob didn't flinch at the gunshot, but inside his stomach twisted into knots. They'd be back, probably with more men, probably with torches and rope. That was how these things always went. He returned to the house where Kaya waited by the window. She'd pulled back the thin curtain just slightly to watch the confrontation, her body tense. Her face was pale but composed, her jaw set with grim determination. "You should not have done that," she said quietly, not looking away from the window. "They will kill you for protecting me. They will come back and burn this place to ash with both of us inside it." "Maybe they will," Jacob admitted, "but I couldn't let them take you. I couldn't stand here and watch them drag you off to whatever they planned." "Why?" Her eyes finally left the window and found his face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "Why would you risk your life for someone you barely know? I am Apache. You are white. My people and your people are enemies. This makes no sense." Jacob looked away, watching through the window as the dust from the departing horses slowly settled across his land. "Because out there in that desert, you were alone and dying and abandoned. I felt that way before, even when I was surrounded by thousands of people. During the war, in the camps, in the battles. After it ended, when I came home to find everything I loved was gone, I couldn't leave you to face that kind of death alone. I couldn't walk away. I wouldn't. Kaya reached out and took his hand in both of hers. Her grip was strong, despite everything she'd been through, despite her small size and her disability. Then we face whatever comes together. If we die standing. Or sitting, in my case. The grim joke surprised a short laugh out of Jacob. Together, then. That night, Jacob worked by lamplight to reinforce the doors and windows of his small farmhouse. He nailed thick boards across the weaker points where bullets might penetrate easily, positioned heavy furniture for barricades that could provide cover. He loaded all his weapons methodically, the way the army had trained him to do, and placed them strategically around the house where he could reach them quickly. 2 rifles by the front windows with clear fields of fire, a shotgun by the back door, pistols within easy reach in every room, extra ammunition laid out in neat rows. He'd learned in the war that preparation and planning meant the difference between life and death, between going home and being buried in an unmarked grave. Kaya watched him work in silence for a while, her expression thoughtful. Then she surprised him by producing a knife from somewhere in her clothing, a good blade with a carved bone handle. "I can fight too," she said, her voice firm and steady. "Don't think because I have no legs that I'm helpless. I may not be able to run, but I can still hurt anyone who comes through that door." Jacob looked at the knife, then at her determined face, and felt something like pride swell in his chest. "I'd never think you were helpless. Anyone who survived what you have, who endured what you've endured, is about as far from helpless as a person could get." They took turns keeping watch through the long night. Jacob tried to insist that Kaya should rest, that he could manage the watch alone, but she refused with a stubbornness he was beginning to recognize. They were in this together, she said firmly, so they'd keep watch together and face what came together. He couldn't argue with that logic, and honestly, he was grateful not to be alone. As dawn finally broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jacob made coffee on the stove. The smell filled the small house, rich and bitter and comforting. He brought 2 cups to the table where Kaya sat in her wheeled chair, her knife still close at hand. The morning was quiet and peaceful, almost deceptively so. Birds sang in the cottonwood trees near the creek. The sky blushed with color. It was hard to believe violence was coming. "What will you do?" Kaya asked, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "When they come back with more men?" "Defend what's mine," Jacob said simply. He met her eyes across the table. "And you're under my protection now. That makes you mine to defend, same as this house and this land. I never asked for a protector." "No, you didn't. But you've got one anyway, whether you want one or not." 2 days passed without incident, 2 days of deceptive peace. Jacob worked his fields while keeping one eye on the horizon, watching for dust clouds that would signal approaching riders. Kaya managed the house, cooked their meals, tended the garden. They fell into a rhythm that felt comfortable and natural, as if they'd been living this way for years instead of weeks. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch and talk while the sun set. Kaya told stories of her childhood, of hunting with her father before the accident took her legs, of the old ways her grandmother had taught her. Jacob shared memories of life before the war, when he'd had parents and siblings and dreams of something other than simple survival. On the 3rd day, the storm finally broke when Carson returned with twice as many men and twice as much hate. Jacob saw them coming from a mile away, a cloud of dust rising from the road. He called Kaya inside immediately and barred the heavy door, checking the reinforcements he'd made. The men surrounded the house in a loose circle, rifles ready and faces grim. There had to be 10 of them at least, maybe more. Carson sat on his horse at the front, looking grimmer and more determined than before. "Last chance, Murphy!" Carson shouted. "Send the Apache out, and we'll let you walk away from this. You can keep your house and your land. We just want her." "No!" Jacob shouted back. "The answer is no. Then you'll die with her. We'll burn you out if we have to. We've got torches and plenty of kerosene. You can come out and surrender, or we can burn you both alive. Your choice." Jacob's answer was a rifle shot over their heads. The bullet cracked through the air, making the horses shy and the men duck. Return fire came immediately, shattering windows and punching holes through the wooden walls. Jacob moved from window to window, shooting carefully, making each bullet count. He'd been a marksman in the war. His first shot took a man in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse. His second shot hit another man's rifle, sending it flying from his hands. Kaya rolled to the back window with a loaded rifle Jacob had shown her how to use. "I told you I could fight," she said grimly, and fired at a man trying to circle around to the barn. The shot missed, but it made the man dive for cover behind a water trough. The siege lasted for hours under the burning sun. Jacob's ammunition ran low as the afternoon wore on. Several of the attackers had been wounded and pulled back, leaving trails of blood in the dust. but the rest held their positions with stubborn determination. Then smoke began to rise from the barn. They'd managed to set it on fire, probably with a torch thrown from cover. Flames licked up the dry wooden walls. Jacob's mind raced with grim calculations. The barn would spread to the house if the wind picked up, and it would pick up as the day heated. They'd be forced out into the open eventually, and that it would be over. He looked at Kaya, preparing to apologize for getting her killed after working so hard to save her life, when new sounds cut through the chaos of gunfire, hoofbeats, many of them coming fast from the west like approaching thunder. Apache warriors crested the ridge above the farm, at least 24 strong, painted for war. They swept down on Carson's men like a thunderstorm. Like divine retribution, their war cries splitting the air. The would-be vigilantes broke immediately and ran, some abandoning their horses in pure panic and fleeing on foot. The Apaches didn't pursue the running men. They simply let the cowards flee, which was somehow more terrifying than if they'd given chase. The warriors' leader dismounted in front of Jacob's house and approached on foot. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with gray streaking his long hair and old scars marking his weathered face. He carried himself like a man who'd led warriors into battle many times and lived to tell about it. Jacob stepped outside cautiously, rifle lowered but ready. Unsure whether he'd just traded one enemy for another, the Apache warrior spoke in his own language, the words flowing like water over stones. Then he switched to heavily accented but clear English. "I am Two Hawks. Kaya is of my people." Kaya rolled herself to the doorway behind Jacob. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice urgent and earnest. Two Hawks listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable as stone. Finally he turned back to Jacob with something that might have been respect in his dark eyes. "She says you saved her life when you could have left her to die. She says you stood against many men to protect her when it would have been easier to hand her over. She says you are a man of honor." "I did what any decent man would do," Jacob said simply. Two Hawks studied him for a long, measuring moment. "No, most men would not have done this. Most would have left her to die in the desert or handed her to those who would kill her for sport. You are not like most men." He gestured to his warriors who were putting out the fire in the barn with water from the creek. "We heard rumors of a white man sheltering one of ours. We came to see if the stories were true or if they were lies told by those who hate us. The stories are true. She's free to go with you if that's what she wants." Kaya spoke again in Apache, her voice firm and final. She said several sentences, her hands moving expressively. Two Hawks listened, then nodded slowly, his weathered face softening slightly. "She says her place is here now," Two Hawks translated. "With you, in this place. She asked for my blessing, as her chief, and her kinsman." Jacob's throat tightened unexpectedly. He looked at Kaya, seeing determination and something else in her face, something that made his heart beat faster. If that's truly what she wants, she's welcome to stay for as long as she likes. Forever, if she chooses. Two Hawks stepped forward and clasped Jacob's forearm in a warrior's grip, strong and firm. "You are friend to my people now, white man. Any who harm you or her will answer to us. This I promise, this I swear." He released Jacob's arm and moved to Kaya, kneeling beside her chair and speaking softly to her in their language. She responded, and he touched her head gently, affectionately, before returning to his horse. The Apache warriors mounted up and rode away as quickly as they'd come, disappearing over the ridge like they'd never been there at all. They left Jacob and Kaya alone amid the smoke and destruction of the battle. The barn was mostly gone, just charred timbers and ash, but the house still stood. They'd survived against all odds. Jacob sank onto the porch steps, exhaustion hitting him all at once like a physical blow. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline draining out of his system. Kaya rolled her chair beside him carefully. They sat in silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of orange and red. "You could have gone with them," Jacob finally said, his voice quiet. "Back to your people, to those who know you." "I could have," Kaya agreed. "But I chose to stay here." "Why?" "They're your people. Your family." Kaya looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Because out there in the desert, I was dying. Here I'm alive. Because you see me as Kaya, as a whole person, not as a woman with no legs who needs to be pitied or hidden away. Because for the first time since I was a child running through grass on two good legs, I feel like I matter to someone. Like I have value beyond memories of what I used to be." Jacob felt something break open in his chest, some wall he'd built to keep the world and its pain out after the war. "You matter to me, more than you know, more than I probably have any right to feel after such a short time." "I know," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "I see it in how you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. How you never treat me as broken or helpless or less than whole. How you risked everything without a moment's hesitation, even though keeping me alive might cost you your own life." He turned to face her fully. "What do we do now?" "They'll talk in town. Some people will never accept this. We rebuild," Kaya said simply. "Together we rebuild what they burned, and we build something new that never existed before. And let them talk. Words can't hurt us if we don't let them." The weeks that followed were hard but good in ways Jacob hadn't experienced in years. He and Kaya worked side by side to restore what the fire had damaged and to improve what had been merely adequate before. Two Hawks was true to his word. Apache warriors arrived with supplies and lumber, gifts from the tribe. They helped raise a new barn, stronger and larger than the one that had burned. Fences were mended with good straight posts. New crops were planted in properly prepared soil. The farm began to look like a real homestead instead of a hermit's refuge. Word spread through the territory about the farmer who'd stood against a mob to protect an Apache woman, and about the warriors who'd come to his aid. Some neighbors kept their distance, viewing Jacob as a traitor to his race, but others came to see for themselves, curious about the unusual household. They found not a traitor or a savage, but a man of clear principle and a woman who contributed as much as any able-bodied person to the farm's success. Slowly, grudgingly, some of them began to accept what they saw. Jacob built Kaya a better wheelchair with his own hands, working late into the night by lamplight. This one was lighter and easier to maneuver, with larger wheels that could handle rough ground. She could navigate the entire property now, rolling along packed dirt paths Jacob created for her. She tended the chickens and collected eggs, worked in the garden with tools adapted for her use, and even helped with repairs that could be done while sitting. Her strength and resilience amazed him daily. She never complained, never spoke of what she'd lost, only of what she could still do. One warm evening, as they shared dinner at the table Jacob had built when he first bought the farm, Kaya asked the question that had been hanging between them for weeks. "What happens when winter comes? Will you still want me here when the snow falls and work is harder?" Jacob set down his fork deliberately and looked at her. "Kaya, I want you here for as long as you'll stay. Winter, spring, summer, fall, and every season that comes after. All of it. All the years we have. People will talk even more than they do now. Let them talk until their tongues fall out. It won't be easy," she pressed. "I'm Apache. You're white. I'm disabled, unable to walk or run or do many things a proper wife should do. People will say terrible things about both of us. They'll call you a fool and call me worse." "I've heard terrible things before," Jacob said firmly. "I've survived worse than gossip and name-calling. I survived 4 years of war and came home to nothing. I can survive talk." He reached across the table and took her hand, holding it gently. "The only thing I can't survive, the only thing I won't survive, is being alone again. Not after knowing what it's like to have you here. Not after knowing what it's like to have someone to talk to share meals with, to care about." Tears glistened in Kaya's eyes, catching the lamplight. "I thought I would die out there in that desert among the rocks. I thought my life was over, that this was how the spirits had chosen to end my story. But you gave me a reason to live again. You gave me a future when I had none. You gave me the same thing," Jacob said quietly. "I was already dead inside before I found you. Just going through the motions of living, waiting for the end. You brought me back to life, gave me a reason to care about tomorrow." They married in the fall, when the cottonwood trees turned gold and the air carried the first hint of winter's approach. 2 Hawks and several tribal elders attended the ceremony, standing alongside the few white neighbors who'd become genuine friends. It was a small ceremony, simple and honest, conducted by a traveling preacher who asked no questions about race or circumstance. The vows they spoke bound 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances imaginable, 2 people who'd been left for dead by the world in different ways. The farm prospered in the years that followed. Jacob and Kaya became known throughout the territory as fair dealers who kept their word and treated everyone with equal respect. They hired workers when the farm needed extra hands, treating everyone fairly regardless of whether they were white, Apache, Mexican, or anything else. Apache and white families alike came to trade, drawn by the couple's reputation for honest business and quality goods. Kaya's skills with herbs and traditional medicine became legendary in the territory. She'd learned from her tribe's healers during the long years when she couldn't hunt or travel, absorbing knowledge that others overlooked. Now she used that knowledge to help anyone who came seeking aid, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Jacob built her a workshop attached to the house where she could dry plants and mix remedies in peace. People traveled from distant towns to see her, to get medicine for their children or healing salves for wounds. She never turned anyone away, though some could pay only with gratitude. Together they created something neither could have imagined alone. Not just a successful farm that produced good crops and healthy animals, but a bridge between two worlds that had known mostly conflict and bloodshed. Their home became neutral ground where Apache and settlers could meet without fear or hostility, where people were judged by their character rather than the color of their skin or the language they spoke. It was a small miracle in a harsh land. Years passed in the way years do, each season flowing into the next. Jacob and Kaya grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season like roots growing down into good soil. The farm expanded as they hired good workers and treated them well. They took in orphans, both Apache and white, giving lost children the home and family they desperately needed. The children didn't care that their mother had no legs or that their parents came from different peoples and different worlds. They cared only that they were loved and safe and fed, that they had a place to belong. On warm evenings, Jacob and Kaya would sit on the porch they'd built together, watching the sun paint the desert sky in shades of fire and gold. Jacob would sometimes think about that day he'd found her among the rocks, circled by patient buzzards barely clinging to life. It felt like another lifetime, like something that had happened to different people. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd ridden a different trail that day?" he asked one evening, his voice quiet in the gathering darkness. "If I'd gone straight home instead of stopping to check on those birds?" Kaya smiled, her hand finding his in the darkness with the ease of long practice. "I don't wonder about such things. I'm grateful for what happened, not curious about what didn't. You saved my life, Jacob. But more than that, much more, you gave me a reason to value that life again. You made me feel human again instead of just a burden to be pitied or abandoned." "You did the same for me," Jacob said, squeezing her hand gently. "I was already dead inside when I found you, already buried even though I was still walking around, just going through motions, waiting for my body to catch up with my spirit. You brought me back to life, gave me something to care about, someone to protect and cherish." "Then we saved each other," Kaya said simply. "We pulled each other back from death, each in our own way." "Yes," Jacob agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd been left for dead by the world in different ways, who'd found each other through what might have been chance or might have been fate. They'd built something beautiful and lasting from the wreckage of their separate pasts. A desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of children's laughter from inside the house. In the house behind them, the orphans they'd taken in laughed over some game, their voices bright with joy. In the barn, horses nickered softly to each other in the darkness. The farm lived and breathed around them, a testament to what could be built when people chose compassion over fear, when they chose understanding over hatred, when they chose love over loneliness. Jacob squeezed Kaya's hand gently, and she squeezed back, a simple gesture that said everything that needed saying. They'd faced death together, prejudice and violence and doubt. They'd overcome all of it by standing together, by refusing to let the world's cruelty break them, and they'd keep facing whatever came side by side for as long as they had breath and heartbeat. The stars emerged one by one overhead, ancient and constant and unchanging. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, certainly, new joys and new sorrows in equal measure. But tonight, Jacob and Kaya simply existed in the peace they'd fought so hard to create, grateful beyond words for the unlikely path that had brought them together and kept them together. A woman left for dead had found life and purpose. A lonely man had found meaning and family. And together, in a harsh land that didn't easily forgive mistakes or weakness, they'd found something precious and rare. They'd found home. They'd found each other. And that, they both knew, was enough. That was everything.